Lee, is there any reason why I just can't do it here? Okay. Go ahead. I'm Bob. I'm an alcoholic. Sober through the grace of God in the AA since the 10th of December, 1967. For that, I'm very grateful. And it's cool being here. I'm a Catholic, and I have some issues with the Bethlehem thing, and but I have issues with everything, and so it doesn't matter. I'm a neurotic, so I'm never comfortable. But when I get here and I interact with the history of AA, I love the history of Alcoholics Anonymous. There's a medical term called Ontogeny, Recapitulates, Phylogeny, which means that the development of the whole has some similarity to the development of the individual embryo in the woman's body, the evolution of man. The evolution of our history is not unlike the evolution of an individual drunk's story. It is a drunk story. I mean, it is a history comprised, the cells of that body of history are drunks. And as a result of that, I mean, it's just this discombobulated, unplanned, grace-filled process that's very much like our lives. So it's just fascinating. I think the most profound thing about our history, and of which there are so many, is that Bill said yes. There have been people who have been called a lot. There are spiritual awakenings. I get a little irritated with some of the history that we're writing today because it gets into the personality and characteristics of Bill and Bob, but more Bill. I like that you... Ms. Soon says she's a friend of Bob. I like that. I think this could be a new movement. We have Friends of Bill. I'm looking to start a little club, Friends of Bob. But he was touched, much like the biblical stories of he was touched by the hand of God. He had a spiritual awakening, and he answered the bell. Now, pretty selfish, self-centered jerk who wasn't able to support his wife. I mean, they're living hand to mouth, losing their home, all the sorts of things. He had plenty of advantages, squandered all of them, and he got called. And as far as I can see in the history of Bill Wilson, never in his role as our founder and leader did he fall down, did he not answer the bell. He had the flaws and personality quirks that come with being a human being. But I am not, we talk about, I always say, if Bob was the only founder, it'd still be an acronym. If Bill was the only founder, he would have franchised it. But that is not, Bill was offered a doctorate from Yale, and we didn't know till 7 years after Bill died that he turned that down. He was broke on his backside and offered a significant job with Towns Hospital and went to a meeting where the new guys that he's helping are, and they said that he shouldn't do it, and he didn't do it. I mean, this man had an extraordinary, as did Bob. I mean, they were just, what they selected from the Oxford group to give us is extraordinary. What they didn't select was extraordinary. That we have ended up with this thing that offers us a chance to replicate spiritual transformation in each other's lives. I don't know think about that just for a moment. I mean, we are, if the Olympics started an asshole team, excuse my language, but one of the places they should recruit would be AA. But when Kelly was talking about the transformation, when he was talking about Jung's word, once in a while, there's a sudden alteration of the fundamental ideas that are guiding our lives are suddenly cast to one side. And that's where the spiritual acts, it can act over time, but it also acts suddenly. There is no time dimension in what Mildred talks about. I enjoyed you so much last time. I remember in 1971 or 1972, you were still drinking, and I was in Prince Albert, and they were talking about you. I was at the Roundup. I'll tell you, she may be the evil nun today, but she was a hot broad when in 1971. In 1971, she was pretty hot, and I was not thinking nun when I first. And I remember sitting in an apartment with you in 1991 when we got our butts handed to us in the real estate business. That was the first time I went broke. And having that conversation of what we're going to do with our lives, that was pretty cool. But why do we gather here? I mean, we're all been around a while. I mean, why do we have this fascination with the stories that we tell? And we're an oral society. Why do we have this fascination with the stories we tell each other? Well, it's the story of Christmas. I mean, we're little. Tell me again, Daddy. Tell me again. I mean, we're at the tree listening to each other tell the story again, and we need to be reminded. And we never tire, having had that experience. It awakens something in us that never totally goes to sleep. It is just it is extraordinary. And I don't know where else in the world, some religions, but in the world, where they've been given the ability to replicate that in a reasonable manner. I mean, if you told someone you could take someone someplace to replicate a spiritual awakening, I think they'd think you should go get your tambourine and go someplace else. That would not be something that most people would find interesting or conceivable or possible. And that's what happens in these rooms. Primarily for two reasons. One is we've been given this transformational program. And the other is we've been given the collapse of our lives. The collapse is what prepares the ground for the reception. The collapse is every bit as important as the program, because it is only with that preparation that most of us could do that. I'm supposed to talk about the 6 and the 7 steps to Alcoholics Anonymous. I came in AA in 1967. I was 23 years old, had my last drink a week after my 24th birthday. I showed up with an enlarged liver. I wasn't a real bad alcoholic, but I was as bad as I could get myself to be in that relatively short period of time. I was, regularly, if I had the time and day, I'd drink a fifth a day. And I ruined whatever I was able to put my hands on in that relatively short period of time. Walked out of Notre Dame, middle of my senior year, lost my commission, could not hold a job. I had dated Linda for some reason. We broke up for a year. I called her about once a month, kind of like a low-grade headache, so she wouldn't get anybody else in her life. And when I came out of my stint as a waiter living on Skid Row, I called her, and I went to a party that night, and I'd been drinking. I drank a quart and a half before I saw you, and I think that was the night I could not speak almost. I was literally you could not understand me. And I asked if she'd meet with me the next day. Now, we hadn't been dating we don't know anymore how long, but maybe a year. And I got back together the next day and asked her if she'd consider getting back to me with the idea of marriage. Now, she's a psychiatric nurse working in an alcohol ward. I have I'm in bad shape. And she said yes. I moved back in my parents' home on the condition I wouldn't drink or was unable to follow that condition. And I and I couldn't stop drinking. and started to go through withdrawal, drink my way out of it. And one day, about 4 months later, we became engaged and married. I thought my life was finally going to be okay, but now I just can't quit. And I woke up hugging a toilet one morning after my morning exercises in my boxer shorts, having missed work 3 days in a row. And that was my moment. I had lots of little moments, but that was my moment. How did you get here? How the hell did you get from where you started out? I called AA. 2 guys came out and talked to me. One guy had 6 months, one guy had 6 years. Said they had an answer for a problem, the drinking problem. They wanted to share it. Didn't matter if I wanted it or not. For some reason, talking to guys like me helped them. And I went to my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. I drank twice after that, once after a month, once after 3 months. And then I had my last drink on our honeymoon on the way back home. Drove off the cliffs at La Quebrada on my honeymoon. Our honeymoon. She thinks I have a pronoun problem. When you're married a long time, you're not entitled to your own experiences and memories. So it's not my honeymoon. It's even so. It's and I met my sponsor at my first meeting. My sponsor, Debbie. I saw Debbie come in Alcoholics Anonymous. She was a Minnesota girl in those days. My sponsor was Warren McGinley. He died. We had 100 years between us when he died. He was my sponsor for 43 years. He had 57 years of sobriety. He was the 12-step champion of the Uptown group of Alcoholics Anonymous. He made more 12-step calls than anybody in that group, and I was his wingman, and that was one of the best experiences I've ever had in my life. He was a powerful, ordinary man. He was a mailman. Second World War, lost half his crew in a bomb disposal unit in Italy. And you would not hire him to take you through the big book, but I'll tell you, he was my big book. There's a lot of people who ain't very fancy that are just stronger in horseradish, and they help build our fellowship, as Warren did. He told me alcoholism was a disease, physical, mental, and spiritual. Once I crossed the line from problem drinking to alcoholism affected me all the time when I was drinking and when I was not drinking. Really a new idea. That my disease could affect me when I was not drinking was really a new idea. Did not understand it, but it resonated. It seemed like that was the truth. They told me they quit one day at a time. I knew that was a trick, but it was kind of a cool trick. And I met a group of attractive men and women, 2 women, Rose and Helen, 30 men, Second World War guys, really attractive men, sharing with this punk kid the same problems. It was just extraordinary to me that these adults were sharing the same problems that I had. It was. So I got into AA head, ass, and overcoat. And in Minnesota, all we had was step discussion meetings. I got into the steps early and got it. I thought, okay, I'll buy it. I'm an alcoholic. If I'm an alcoholic and AA's got the answer, I've got these other issues that are going on in my life, and if AA's got the answer, those other issues ought to be handled, and hell, it might take a year. And might take 50 from what I've been able to discover so far. We make extraordinary progress in our first years of sobriety. With the hindsight that I have as being sober for a while, I think most of the progress we made is dealing with the consequences of our drinking. We talk about it often as if we're dealing with our defects of character, but most of us in the early days are dealing with the crop of manure whose seeds we had been sowing for the previous 10 or 15 years before we came in. And we come in with problems with the IRS, with our spouses, with finance, with, jail, with all the sorts of things that we have, physical issues. And those are the issues that we are engaged with, and they help keep us somewhat surrendered. They help keep us somewhat more humble. And during that period of time, most of us are as teachable as we've ever been in our lives. And then our egos start to come back. Every question I asked during my first year of sobriety, I got an answer. In my second year of sobriety, I wasn't sure you were right. I literally started to reassert myself and to question both and notice the flaws. You have to, notice the flaws. And I'm going to read you, so I'm going to talk about problems in sobriety. I think many people are surprised why the dealing with the 6 and the 7 step are so sparse in the big book and why they are so expanded in the 12 and 12. And the arch conservatives of AA think God wrote the big book and that Bill wrote the 12 and 12 in his garage with Tom Powers. I mean, they don't really think the 12 and 12 is as nearly as inspired as the big book. I love both those pieces of literature and find them deep and helpful. There's a historian in AA by the name of Mel Barger Mel B. Sorry, Mel. So, before I read that letter. So I found myself, I didn't have a very good sense of my defects of character during my first year. I had taken the 4th and 5th step, but I had gotten into the worst things that I had done, the things I felt most ashamed of, and that was more of it was actually a general confession, as the book alludes to for people who are Catholic, and that might be something they did. My second year, I started to get handed my defects of character. My defects of character, if you would have asked me what they were over a period of time, I had trouble getting up in the morning. I had trouble getting to work. I had some trouble staying at work, and I had some difficulty working at work. Other than that, I was a pretty good worker. I spent more money than I made. If you do that regularly, you end up in debt. I had a gambling problem, more of a hobby, 4 or 5 hours a day, 4 or 5 days a week, but I'm making $5 to $10 grand a year playing backgammon in 1967. That was like my real job. Okay. And then we started to have children, and I was loud, patient, and angry, immature, and sometimes violent with my children. Our children. And I'm not proud of that fact. I'm ashamed of that fact. But that was the way it was. Those were not annual problems or monthly problems. Those were daily problems. None of those made my first two. Well, none of them made my first 5th step. I mean, isn't that extraordinary that you would have that list of issues and none of them would make your first, 4th, and 5th step? They made partial. I'm telling my sponsor about 60% of what's going on, and I know in Ohio you do 100. I think that's just absolutely terrific that you do that. But I'm only telling myself 60%. Life is lived forward, but it's understood backwards. You don't see it when you're in it, and you don't really see it until your nose is really pushed in it. At 7 years of sobriety, I'm at the end of my rope. I came in here, I had a wall built around me, tore the wall down, made a discovery. The discovery was I'm not unique. My personality may be unique, but not my illness, not my behavior, not my experience, not my feelings. I started to have a sense of hope that what worked for you could work for me, and I started to get into the steps to do that. And then I started to reconstruct the wall in sobriety. Thank you very much for helping me with my drinking problem, but stay out of my sex life. Stay out of my marriage, stay out of my finances, stay out of my business, stay out of my work, stay out of my gambling. Brick by brick, I built the darn thing back up sober, going to 6 or 7 meetings a week, found myself as isolated, as afraid, as problematic at 7 years of sobriety as I was when I walked in. You could be pretty ashamed about that. That's the story of my life. Great starter, poor finisher. Mother always said, Bob, you're not very bright, dress well. I have tried, that is, I look good, but I don't, there's no substance. I'm a suit. It is, it's all there is, guys. And My mother had a tongue like a razor blade. But a pretty neat lady. So I found myself failing at 7 years of sobriety, which I thought was the way it always was. I could get in Notre Dame, couldn't finish Notre Dame. I could, one time I wanted to be a priest. My faith was important to me. Couldn't really, once I found masturbation and drinking. Goodbye. I just, it was, you have to make those difficult choices in life. It is, thank you. That was just my start. But I went idealist, and I thought that if I came into Alcoholics Anonymous, I really felt like when I walked in the front door of Alcoholics Anonymous, I found my people and I found my answer. You want to talk about a gift? I work with a lot of young people. Almost none of them early on got well. I loved AA from the moment I walked in the door. It's not been hard for me to stay. It's been hard for me to do the work, but it's not been hard for me to stay. You are my people. This is my place. I know more about who I am when I'm sitting in this seat than any place in the world. Any place. I know more about this than I know about being a father. And I'm the father of 3 sons who are in the program. My wife is a carrier. None of us were alcoholic when we met her. Let that out. So. No? Oh. Careful. About to be attacked. I know. So you can imagine the disillusionment, again, that one more time I start well and end poorly. That I'm at 7 years of sobriety looking to put a gun in my mouth. I'm not looking to drink. I'm done. I'm just tired of being me. I'm tired of looking good and having nothing underneath it. And that's when I had my second spiritual. So I did a 4th and 5th step. My third 4th and 5th step, best 4th and 5th step I've taken. I've taken 20 or 25, or I've taken a lot of them. Best one I ever took, 3 years. I was as beaten down as I could be. Went to my sponsor, and I said, I did the first 2 with clergy, the third one with my sponsor. I said, I'm going to do whatever you reckon. I feel like I'm dying of thirst lying next to a lake. I am so god darn sick and tired of being me that I couldn't tell you how sick and tired I am of being me. I know what to do. I can't or won't do it. I could pass the test. I could tell you what to do, and I can't or won't do it. Got sponsees that are making more progress than I'm making. I got to figure out what God has to do with Wednesday, and I got a problem with that. And the problem is that if I turn myself into God, what's he going to do? Clean up your act, go to work, stay at work, work at work. Get on a budget, which I think is an Al-Anon term. It's not in the book. It is a harsh word. Be kind and loving to your wife. Be gentle with your children. All this. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out what your higher power would have someone with my list of defects of character. And I'm rambling, so I'm going to get. So. When I was done, he wanted me to go to a psychologist. I went to a psychologist. I had to work around work issues, money issues, failure issues, success issues. The psychologist wanted my wife involved. I did not want my wife involved. It's always a different conversation when your wife's in the room. There's a different data bank when your wife's in the room. And what I discovered in the room was fear. I can't go through the preliminary because I don't have the time, but what I discovered in the room was fear. And he asked me why I was so afraid of failing. I'm busting my ass 2 or 3 hours a day. My business is going down the chute. I don't know why I'm having trouble. And my response to his question is I wanted to hit him. I literally wanted to hit him. And When I got inside of that, over a period of time, marinated it, I found out that I was afraid of being a husband. I was afraid of being a father. I was afraid of work. I was afraid of failure. I was afraid of success. I was swimming in fear. The old Chamberlain thing about the fishes in the ocean, isn't the ocean wonderful? What's the ocean? I'm swimming in it and I can't see it. And so now I'm at the point of a second surrender. I go home. I'm home a couple of weeks after that meeting with that psychologist, and I had a really bad day where I'd done a lot of things I wasn't supposed to do. And I said, gee, it happened again. And he said, well, weren't you there? I said, yeah, I'm there, but it's so habitual. I don't even have to think. It's like I'm in a blackout. I just kind of fall into these patterns, and all of a sudden I realized that was a bunch of crap. It sounded like a guy who wanted to quit gambling. I wanted to gamble whenever I wanted to gamble without having problems with gambling. Wanted money without work. Wanted my children's and wife's love and affection without spending time with them. Not a very good design. And I realized 7.5 or 8 years sober, Linda's gone through a similar collapse at the same time I am, that I had tried as hard as I knew how to try and failed to clean my act up. And all of a sudden, for some reason, I was able to hear those words. I think I would have argued with them because I'm 8 years, so I've got enough sobriety that I could argue that I'm doing some stuff right. And I was given the privilege and opportunity to take the 6th and the 7th step of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous at a depth of which I had not been able to take them or even understand that I should take them up to that time. And 4 of the major problems of my life disappeared that night in my living room, such as the power of the 6th and the 7th step and the grace of this program of God. Now, every time I've made a change like that, and doctor doesn't heal. He creates an aseptic environment, creates an atmosphere in which healing can take place. God doesn't, a farmer doesn't grow. He plants a seed and creates a fertile environment and creates an atmosphere in which growth can take place, and God grows, and we don't change. Okay, and that's kind of what I want to talk about a little bit on this deal. And there's a lot of people who, there's more teaching on the 12 steps than there's ever been today. And you get the impression that if you just do them right, you'll be okay. Well, I tell you, they're spiritual processes. They're not mechanical processes. If they were mechanical processes, all you'd have to do is say the 3rd step prayer and click your heels, and you'd be back in Kansas. So if you're hearing that there's, if you just do it right, you're going to be okay. Bullshit. You're not capable of doing it right. You don't have the ability to do it right. It isn't, if you're going to rely on yourself to do it right, you're in deep trouble. Your life is not manageable. But the world is telling you, get the right information, get the right wisdom, get the tips, get the book, and you'll be okay. Bullshit. If you're married and you've got children and you've got a job, anybody knocking it out of the park? And then you add to it the disease of alcoholism, the self-centeredness, the delusion, the dishonesty, the flaws that we bring, the neurosis that we bring into these rooms. Anybody knocking it out of the park? Now there's transformation. There's changes at levels that you could not imagine, but you don't own it. You don't own it. I want to read to you a letter that Mel wrote to Bill. So Mel meets Bill in 1951. He's back meeting Bill in 1955 in Cleveland. He wants to talk to Bill. Bill's too busy. Write me a letter. There's a couple of so Mel wants to know 2 things. Tell me about your spiritual awakening. And why in the 12 and 12 are you so much more negative than you are in the big book? He didn't use those words, but close. So Bill's talking to him and said, I fail to make the point I often fail to make the point that every AA who has the program gets the same thing. The only difference is that I can see is that most experiences are strung out over a long period of time. In these sudden events, I think the ego gives way at depth in complete collapse, at least momentarily. That permits a huge inrush of grace that brings a vision. In most cases, grace leaks in little by little. Therefore, I can't hold with most theologians that these sudden experiences are something very special and unique. If you were to take the sum total of your own transformation since you have been in AA and condense the whole business into 6 minutes, you too would see stars and more. So he's saying that the sum total of our collective experience over the time of our sobriety is similar to the inrush that he had. And then he goes on and he's talking. I think people are uncomfortable with the discussion of Bill's depression, like he was doing something wrong. And there's a lot of explanations for it, like it was his fault. And I love the humility. This is just a guy who's sober 5 years, writing to Bill, and Bill's answering this guy. He doesn't know Mel well. I mean, Mel had been to his house once or twice. He doesn't know Mel well. And he says, in my role as Mr. AA, I have been unable to manage fairly well. But as one neurotic drug trying to get along and grow, I have often been pathetically rebellious and rationalized. Practically all the sins I didn't have time for when drinking, I have since fallen for in the last 12 years of my life. And then he talks about, despite all my blessings and opportunity, I spent the last 8 years in depression, sometimes very severe ones. However, there's been some benefit. And then he talked about I've been forced to sit at home, and because I sat at home, I've been able to take a look at the structure of Alcoholics Anonymous, the present service structure, and write the traditions. It's not a bad depression, considering he wrote the 12 steps in one of his depressive moves. You know, Dr. Bob was made of better stuff. In his personal life, he always came closer to the spiritual achievements I never did. He seemed never to have been victimized by the awful conflicts, though of this I am not sure, because he was a real stoic. Unlike me, he was a vast reader of spiritual and psychic literature. He had a great library of it, which I went through with Sue. And by contrast with my own reading, has been very sparse. I have rather relied more on observation and conversation. I guess I'm still a shopper at the theological pie counter, still wondering in many respects what's it all about. So, my friends, now you have the latest bulletin on my own state of grace. I do hope it helps reduce any overestimate that you may have about me. I do hope for another thing, the real impossible, that someday the society will let me become a member. You know, almost no founders are ever allowed to be members of their societies. So most of us find ourselves sober 7, 8, 9, 10 years. So I think somewhere between 5 and 15 years you get your backside handed to you. I do not think it's an indication that you're practicing your program wrong. I think it is the nature of the spiritual walk. I think you deal with the consequences of your early sobriety, and then over a period of time you start to get in touch with your character issues. In my inventory work, I've had some issues over the last couple of years. Where the hell did I? And I found a list that a guy from Chicago who was famous for doing multiple fifth steps, Paul M., sober 62 years when he died. Interesting guy. Got sober in 47, I think. And so now, and I've been just recently trying to use his list of defects of characters. And so whenever he has an issue and whenever he's doing an inventory, when he's got an issue that he's dealing with, what he uses is the 7 deadly sins, and then he adds to the list. So I'm just going to quickly say these to you, that he takes the 7 deadly sins of pride, lust, anger, envy, greed, sloth, and gluttony, and then he adds to it resentments, dishonesty, sex, selfishness, self-pity, fear, sarcasm, intolerance, jealousy, and money. And so in any issue that I'm dealing with in my life, so I have trouble on an ongoing basis. If I'm just going to go back to my fifth step and take a look at what my defects of character are, I find for some reason this is allowing me to get a little bit fresher look at what's going on in my life today. So I'm just using this as an outline or a step to take a look at what my defects of character are. I can tell you the events. I can tell you what I did wrong. I can kind of guess at it. But this list has helped me a little bit, illumine some of those things. The mind, I think the largest problem we have in Alcoholics Anonymous today is that we're trying to use psychology to practice a spiritual program. Psychology is the religion of the day. We take what we're relying on is what we know. We're relying on our information, what we know about the book, what we know about the steps. That's not sufficient. It's a spiritual process. It is not about insight. It is not about knowledge. They're helpful, but they are not deep enough to take the change that we need. It is not mechanical. It's a spiritual process. So there's a way of being that we have to be in that process to present ourselves to have the full benefit. There's a hell of a lot of step work that I have done that I've gotten little or no benefit, seemingly, at the time that I did it. And I still do that. Because mechanically doing the steps is better than not doing them. Okay, but you don't always get the magic. Because I don't always come to it in a way that I'm free enough and unclogged enough that I can get that process through. And over a period of time, you have to be a pretty good searcher to be willing to attend to your defects of character and your character issues over a period of time. Most of us don't really want that conversation. So imagine that I'm dealing with a guy who's 40 years old, married, and he's going through the fourth step and he's having trouble with the columns, and I'm saying, hey, don't worry about it. It's complicated. I want to try something with you. I said, just get your wife, your parents, your brother and sister, your ex-wife, your boss, a couple of neighbors and a couple of guys from the group, and bring them over to your house, serve coffee, and then pass out. Here's what I want you to say to them. We'll say, we have a step in Alcoholics Anonymous where we try to get in touch with our defects of character, and I'm having trouble identifying mine. And then pass out pencils and paper and leave. Okay. Or if you've been a member of a home group for a real long time, just have your group do it. I mean, you'd have a hell of a start. If you're one of the lucky people that sponsor 15 or 20 or 30 people, have your sponsees do it. Now, most of us wouldn't call that meeting. You know why? We don't want to change. I don't think any of us really understand how so that is. We don't want to change. But it's one level worse than that. We don't want to know. You change your wife. We're not having, you say to your wife, we're not having that conversation. Want to have that conversation? It's going to be a tough conversation. You train your kids as to what they can say and what they can't say. You train your boss. You train your sponsor. Your sponsor knows about what you're willing to do and not willing to do. Saying your sponsor doesn't have the conversation with you, well, you're not in the game. Why would I have that conversation with you? When I came into Alcoholics Anonymous, over the first 7 years of my life, I tried and failed to deal with the defects of character in my life. Tried and failed, but I still grew. There comes a time where you either change or you stop growing. When you stop growing, you build an addition onto your house to accommodate the problem. Chasers hang out with the chasers, gamblers hang out with the gamblers, and I make a deal. I won't call you on your crap, you don't call me on mine. Deal? Bad deal. The players, the people who one of the reasons I don't enjoy giving AA talks like I used to. It used to be really a big deal, kind of a prideful deal. I still enjoy it. But mostly, the interaction with the people that I get to interact with in these processes is what keeps me younger and keeps me engaged and keeps me vital in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I want to be with the players. Who are the players for me? They're not perfect. They're just in the game. They really are genuinely trying to live their life in a good manner. They're not, and we're perfect, not even close. But we're really in the game. We're player coaches, we're on the field. We're not in the stands just telling people. We really are trying to practice the principles in all our affairs. But if you're going to be a player, you're going to have to attend to the defects of character. Some of the defects of character that we bring into the program are deep enough and flawed enough that if we don't deal with them, we're going to get drunk. You have to get rid of the things that you can't do sober. You probably should get rid of the illegal things. I mean, there's a list of priorities, and then we get into the moral things, and then you go down that list and you start getting into personality quirks, and there isn't much evidence that you're going to get rid of those. Judging from, I won't talk about home judgment. But if we come to that process alone, we're not going to go after the right things. We're not going to know what the defects are. We're going to know what. So when we come to alcohol and we say alcohol is but a symptom, when we go into our defects of character alone, we're going to find the symptoms. We're not going to always find the causes and conditions. And if you don't find enough of the causes and conditions of the serious issues of your life, you will not have the full measure of life. You'll have relationships, but not maybe a lasting marriage. You'll have a job, but maybe not a career. You won't have the friends, and you won't have as much love in your life as you would like to have. You will not have the honesty you will have, because we come in here with a toolkit that we have built up over our lives. My toolkit was entirely full of hammers. No saws, no screwdrivers, no pliers. When your only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. That's the only, you learn how to adjust, take a big, but it doesn't work. We are still powerless. We talk about it like how long you've been sober, like that is the measure, okay? But it is still an emotional and spiritual disease that has not abated. Our neurosis is still present. And I don't want to say that in a negative sort of way. Our strength, like Paul in the Bible, our strength is our weakness. There's a lot of women who I run into that kind of struggle with the fact that there's powerlessness. I mean, you're powerless like a lamp. I mean, it's designed to be plugged in. It's designed to have the power flow through it. That is the design. It isn't a weakness. It is the design. And then when we talk about dealing with the defects of character, one of my favorite spots in the book, page 34, it says, for those unable to drink, and here, if I'm sometimes working with an issue with myself or another man, I'll throw in a different word, sex or, gambling. I mean, it says, for those who are unable to drink moderately, the question is how to stop altogether. We're assuming, of course, that you want to stop. Whether or not such a person can quit. So let's talk about pornography, or let's talk about spending money, let's talk about overeating, let's talk about anger, let's talking about being mean to your wife and children, let's talk about, whether or not such a person can quit on a non-spiritual basis depends upon the extent to which he has already lost the power to choose, whether he will repeat that behavior. And then later it talks about, if you repeat the behavior, you're going to get drunk, and that's, later on when we talk about the sex inventory. But whether or not a person can quit on a non-spiritual basis depends upon the extent that they have lost the ability to choose. Now that describes about every ongoing problem I've had in my life. Is there anybody in the room that has a serious problem that's new? Anybody have one less than 5 years? But think of that. I mean, that's, so when you wonder why Bill Wilson wrote the 12 and 12 and why he's a little less expressive about suddenly, when he's writing the big book, he's talking about now these are about to be cast out. When you're early in sobriety and he is still full of the Holy Spirit, he is full of the grace that allowed him to transform his life, and he goes through the confession and he says, now, you're entirely ready? You bet. You're going to ask God to remove your defects of character? Yes. No question, no hesitation. Now take him to 1953 when he publishes the 12 and 12, when he's 18 or 19 years sober, and when you take a look, or take me when I'm sober 45 years, still looking at a fairly substantial list of defects of character. Why aren't they gone? If you've got a spiritual program, if God's in the center of your life, why aren't they gone? And I think that is the great dichotomy of any spiritual walk. And all I can tell you is I'm doing the best I can. I'm not trying to use that as an excuse. I'm in love with my wife. I'm generally self-supporting through my own contributions. I'm doing the deal. And I'm better than I ever have been. Perfect? No. But it's okay. It's okay. I can live in a glass house. I don't really have anything that I have to, hide or put out in the garage anymore. I literally live. My life is fuller and better than it has ever been. But if you're going to be entirely ready to have God remove the defects of character, if you're really going to, now, what does Chamberlain say? There's only one problem, one solution. Problems, the sense of separation, the solutions, being connected. He also used to say, I remember I'm sitting in a Gopher State and we're in his room. We'd stay up in his room till 2 a.m. He would hold court. And he said something, he said, look, kid, he said, you're as good right now as you are ever going to be. He said, I can tell you're disappointed in that. I said, hell, I don't even understand it. Rather than be disappointed. But what he said is, you're already where you're going. You're not going anywhere. The process of finding God is a process of removal, not addition, as Mildred alluded to with Eckhart's quote. The man committing rape in the street right now is doing the best he knows how to do according to his light. When he has more light, he will do better. Hard thing to hear, especially in today's vernacular. This was 40 years ago. But if we don't change our consciousness, we're not going to change. If I had a magic wand to remove every problem we have in this room on the condition that we come back here in 10 years, if your consciousness had not altered in that period of time, you will have recreated the problems that I removed today. The process of opening up and changing our consciousness is the process of the steps. But but this is a spiritual process. We do not have the power to implement these steps. It is. So if you were going to go, and I think that most of us, when we come into these rooms with our minds, is we're looking for tips, we're looking for new information, we're looking for someone, going to go listen to, Kelly do the 4th and 5th step, and I'm going to get some tips a little bit different because I feel like I'm missing something. If I get this, and I'm going to go back and God, I heard that, go back to your group and talk about, what Ralph took me through. I went out to L.A. and went through his little workshop, like we don't know how to do it in Minnesota, like it is. It is. The mind wants the answer. The answer is the booby prize. Most of us have the answer. We don't have the power. We know what to do. We can't do it. And that's not making us bad. That is the way it is. But most of us, so the answer is to turn yourself into God. But the ego doesn't want to do that. To do that perfectly is for the ego to die. Not going to happen. The ego's saying, look, do whatever the hell you want to do. Go to the meetings, do the steps, but get this straight. We're not changing. All right? Have fun. But we're not changing. That's just, it's a battle, guys. Otherwise, we wouldn't be sitting in a room with problems that are 5 and 10 years old. Okay? But most of us are afraid to go into that process because we're afraid of God. If you're Catholic, you got to be a little afraid of God, unless you're enlightened. It is, and I'm not sure I want to be 100% cleansed. I'm not sure that I want to have no control. And I don't know if I should go all the way to the bottom line, but why not? Many years ago, when you were talking about, before you were talking about the little Bobby Earl sect that you had going, when you talked about, I did a lot of work with Est. And I remember I'm sitting in one of the warm-up things, and the man is saying, "You are God." I almost got up out of my chair and ran out of the room. It was one of the hardest things I have ever heard anybody say to me. And over my 45 years in AA and my previous 20-some years of education in the Catholic Church, I made a discovery, and I think we're God in drag. I think we're coming home. I think the process of finding God is the process of removing what's in our way and finding out who we have always been. We're going to open the box and find the gift. We're going to take the ribbon off the gift, ribbon off the box, and find out what instrument we're supposed to play in the orchestra of life. My spiritual advisor said to me, if I took a cell out of your hand, everything that cell is Bob Bazan's. Now, the cell isn't everything Bob Bazan's is, but everything that that cell is Bob Bazan's. So I'm not everything that God is, but is it possible that everything I am is God? When you sit in a room and you hear someone say something that is, all of us that have been on 12-step calls or we're sitting in a room, someone will say something you have never heard before that you just know is right. And your soul just goes, oh yeah. It doesn't go, I like that. Gee, isn't that interesting? I'm going to write that down. It goes, oh yeah. It doesn't think it's right. It knows. There is a space inside of us where we coincide and coexist with the God of our understanding. And in that space, there is just peace. That's why in meetings we have this, we're just able to be present. We get out of that time-bound conversation, get out of the circumstance, because if you're running the show, all there is intellect and ego. When your intellect and ego is in charge, it's just all circumstance-bound. When your life is God-centered, there's a space that exists no place else. In that space is presence. And in that presence, you are not there. That space and peace and presence ends with your observing yourself, observing that. So ultimately, if I could have a sense of God as being who I am at my deepest sense, we hear a lot about the wisdom teachers talk about true self and false self. And that our ego is the collection of falsehoods about ourselves that we've collected over a lifetime. And that our true self is the fact that we're spiritual beings on a human journey, not a human being on a spiritual journey. And that the alteration that we're trying to get in Alcoholics Anonymous is an alteration in being, not an alteration in doing. The mechanical conversation about the steps is a conversation about doing. Now, there are always things that we will have to do because we have a practice. We will have to go to, not have to, we will go to meetings, we will read the book, we will do the steps, we will have sponsors. We will interact into the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. But the power, the change, comes in the alteration of being. When your being alters, everything you do changes. That is what Jung was talking about with Hazard. It is, and that's the flow of life, from being to doing, not from doing to being. But the mind says, when you do the right things, you'll be okay. No. When you be okay, you will do the right things. The power is not ours. It is, the power of the program to Chamberlain. I'm at a conference with Chamberlain a long time ago, and he's going to go to the Peachford conference in Atlanta, where the Huntley doctor, whatever his name was, had all the experts on alcoholism. Chuck normally didn't talk too much at non-AA stuff, but so he goes to this conference. I'm at another conference with him about a month later, and someone said, how did you like the symposium with all the people who are in the field of alcoholism? And he said, well, they don't know much about surrender. If you were going to, he'd go, hee, hee, hee. If you were if I came to your house broken and in trouble, you may not immediately know what to do, but if you're in the program and you're trying to do the deal, eventually you would try to get me to a point of surrender. You would try to get me to a point to say the circumstances aren't important. Let go. Fall into it. Fall through the trap door. The fire is illusionary. The spiritual path is through the fire. The fire is illusionary. On the other side is magic. And when Bill talks in the 12 and 12, in 6 and 7, about his character flaws, when he talks about his alcoholism, he talks about being released. And he doesn't talk about quitting. He talks about being released. And I want to read, I still have a couple of minutes. My favorite, I didn't want you to read my favorite thing. My biggest worry was that I was going to get Mike introducing me, but I'm glad I didn't. So the biggest issue we have is that we are trying to use our own information, our own strength, our own control, our own management of the steps. I'm trying to implement the AA program. It never occurs to me that I can't. Now it's both. So I'm not a dummy. It's both. But at the most practical level, and there should be some joy and peace in this, rather than beating ourselves to death. Most of us couldn't hire someone to be as unkind to ourselves as we are. This isn't about good guys and bad guys. This is about knowing and not knowing. And over a period of time, we just get the opportunity to know at a little deeper level. That's all it is. Maybe I would behave differently if I was preparing myself to receive a gift than I was if I was collecting information to perform better. Maybe if I had a more full reliance on the God of my understanding rather than have to get the right information and implement it myself, I would behave differently. And on page 84, 85, the promise is after the 10th step, but it says that we have ceased fighting anything or anyone for even alcohol, for by this time sanity will have returned. We will seldom be interested in liquor, and if tempted, we will recoil as if from a hot flame. We react sanely and normally. We find that this has happened automatically. Did I do that? We will see that our new attitude towards liquor has been given to us without any thought or effort on our part. It just comes as a miracle of it. Did I do that? We are not fighting it, neither are we avoiding temptation. We feel as though we've been placed in a position of neutrality, safe and protected. We have not sworn off. Instead, the problem has been removed. Did I do that? It doesn't exist for us. We're neither cocky nor we're afraid. This is how we react as long as we're in fit spiritual condition. It's both those things. It is both doing, but it is very significantly not doing. And that many of us are attacking the symptoms of the issues in our life. And because our relationship with God is one of psychology and mind, we are afraid to fall into the arms of our God, to let go of the control. We are trying to do something that is undoable. We are trying to manage our lives with the AA program. And we do not have the power or the ability to do that. Thank you.